Well guys, welcome to our final broadcasting conversation. I'm Ali, I've been hosting them all week. We've had all sorts of good discussions and today is one I'm really excited about. Just to say, our sponsors have been the Scottish Power Foundation and the William Grant Foundation. Devastated to announce they didn't pay for this suit, but I'll put it in for the expenses. I thought I'd dress up like this because today's subject is of course news. Just put your hand up for me, just out of curiosity. Do you know what we do here at Kelvin Hall Moving Image Archive? Yes. So yeah, the trustees, the trustees are fairly well up on it. But just for the rest of you, so you know, this is the National Library of Scotland's Moving Image Archive. So there's all sorts of moving image here. MG Alapa, the Gaelic channel, there's loads and loads of Gaelic content in these archives. There's loads of amateur footage from like amateur filmmakers from the 60s and 70s that have fascinating films in there. And of course, there's loads and loads of news archive. So if you're ever looking for moving image stuff, if you're looking for, I found an amazing seam of great recorded poetry over the years from some of the great names of the 20th century, Scots language renaissance, your Hugh McDermott, that kind of thing. There's loads of that kind of thing in here. So anything you're interested in, it's free to access. You can come into this room, as you've seen down there, and get all the time you want to explore this incredible resource. We'll play out some of those clips and we'll be talking about news. Now, it's our last one, so let's have a bit of fun with it. I want a big round of applause, some stamping feet, some cheers for our guests. Our first guest is Laura Maxwell. And our second guest, fresh from the SNP leadership hustings, is Colin Mackay of SNP. So I thought we'd just start off with a really easy question, get the ball rolling, then we'll play out some clips. So I think Laura first, what is news for?
Gosh, facts and figures and letting the audience know as many of them as possible. I mean, that's the basics of it. Just if you want a news bulletin, you want to know what the top line is and you want to know the facts and the figures that back up that story. Then when you get into programmes like Good Morning Scotland, you want a bit more analysis and in-depth analysis. But first and foremost, it's about information and getting it out to the public.
Absolutely. Colin?
It's about telling you stuff. It's about telling you what's going on in your own country, in your own community. Broader than that, obviously, if you're doing international stuff. But, you know, it's not quite glorified gossip. But, you know, it's not a million miles from that. Have you seen The Banshees of Inisherin? Has everybody seen that? You know the bit in the shop, or Ireland's shop, where the wee woman is obsessed by news, and somebody tells her a story and says, "That's not news, that's right news. We want proper news." And that's essentially, I mean, it's as old as the hills. You know, news is new, but you know, the concept of it is just, it's been around forever. It's just about telling people stuff. It's about exchanging information.
Absolutely. I wanted to take us on to the independence referendum, because the BBC does have, when I was looking at the kind of statistics of trust, the BBC is less trusted in Scotland than it is in the rest of the UK, and that divergence seems to have occurred around the independence referendum. Was there first of all, how was it to be a broadcaster during that? I'll come to yourself first. And then for the next independence referendum, if there is one, was there lessons you've learned that you do differently off the back of the first independence referendum and off the back of the Brexit referendum? We've seen the ways that different camps use information and attempt to use the media differently. First of all, how was the first independence referendum and how was it striking a balance?
I found striking a balance really easily, just because for most journalists, I think it's instinctive. For most broadcast journalists, it's just instinctive. You just balance things. And I don't think we had one complaint from either side about our coverage of that. Mm-hmm. But I know that there were a lot of people who were angry at what they saw as some of the BBC coverage. Now, what they were angry at, from my recollection, was they were angry at some of the BBC UK coverage, not the BBC Scotland coverage, was what I was thinking. But, you know, a lot of punters don't necessarily differentiate between that. And, there were times where I was, you know, at protests or whatever, reporting them, and got some abuse from people from either side. But, you know, you kind of get used to it.
Aggressive media skepticism seems to be an underlying thing around all of these. Every election now, like the SNP leadership, you saw that same undercurrent. Brexit, massive undercurrents of, the press are doing this line, they're doing that line. Do you find that affects you? Do you find that kind of people accuse you of certain...
Oh yeah, I mean, if you look on Twitter, I'm all sorts of awful things to all sorts of different people.
Me too.
Both
sides.
Depending on which side they're on.
Yeah.
Because, although what I do is, in my view, balanced, then a lot of people, I think, particularly online, have lost sight of balance. So basically, if you're not saying what they think you should be saying, you're not balanced. Mm-hmm. Whereas actually, you've got to just try and get it down the middle.
Laura, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's about fairness, isn't it? I don't think there's a journalist in the room who doesn't have bias. But you kind of take it off and you leave it at the front door when you go into a building. If you're going on air, you want to be factual and fair. So it depends. Sometimes the listeners listen with bias. And if they don't hear exactly what their line is that day, then they're annoyed by that interview. If you are interviewing a government minister, a UK government minister, then you'll get people shouting at you on Twitter about the fact that you interrupted that government minister. You'll get people shouting about the fact that you... didn't give them a hard enough time, and you get both sides shouting at you by text and by Twitter, and it comes straight to us while we're on air. So actually we're quite careful. We can see the complaints rolling in from the listeners as it happens. And sometimes that's not a great place to be, because it leaves you second guessing yourself sometimes.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it also keeps you very honest. Because if you can see why people are irritated with you, you can tread a fine line. You can ask the questions of both sides.
That must be really tough, because I get it afterwards. Mm-hmm. But getting it live, that must be much, much harder to deal with.
It is, and you do, but also you look at the Twitter feeds that are coming into you and you're going, well, I can see that person doesn't like the BBC, and I can see that they're not listening to the programme.
Yeah.
And people who do listen to the programme, they tweet for different reasons. They'll say, I didn't agree with the line you took on this.
Sure.
Why did you not ask about that? And then you can actually reply to them on Twitter and say, did you listen to the interview we did at 8:10 when we did speak to somebody from your side of the political debate? Oh no, I missed that, sorry. Go and have a listen again.
Massively.
They can listen back.
So I work in media in Westminster quite a lot, and one of the jobs I do is I sort of get MPs appearing on interview panels, on radio shows, and it's my job also to look at how they are responded to. And it's like they're living in parallel universes. A lot of the Twitter feedback you get is massively positive towards the MPs, and then massively negative towards the interviewers, no matter what the interviewer's done. It's entirely legitimate to interrupt. Colin, have you ever interrupted a politician? So I'll just quickly ground this. Colin recently went extremely viral. Has anyone seen the clip of him interviewing Rishi Sunak? Absolutely terrific. So, Colin, do you want to run us through it?
Well, do you know, it was in Invergordon, but I was driving up on the Thursday to do it was in January, I think, just after Christmas and New Year, and I was driving up, and I'd interviewed Nicola Sturgeon on the Monday of that week, and as I was driving up, one of my bosses phoned me and said, yeah, I'm just dealing with all the complaints about your interview with Nicola Sturgeon. And it was mostly because, when she was wittering or blethering or whatever, I'd interrupted her. If she was just plainly avoiding the question, then I interrupted her because, I'm sorry, it just sometimes you can't help yourself. They're just irritating. And so I was driving up and she was saying, I said, how many? Well, I said, a couple of dozen or something like that. And then as I was driving down after interviewing Rishi Sunak, I was thinking, God, how many are you going to get from that? And that was before it went viral. That was on the Friday night. Because we ran the story on the Friday night. Actually, I was more pleased with the other story that I'd had on, which was about an hour before it went on, I got wind that they were going to have a deal on the NHS pay, which to me was a much more interesting story, a much bigger story. But obviously I did that, then did the Rishi Sunak story, and basically he just wouldn't answer any of my questions.
Hilarious.
And
let's recreate it. Let's recreate it for the audience, because there's actually a few folk here that haven't seen it.
Really
so I'm going to be Colin Mackay.
Just go and look at it online.
No, I'll be Colin Mackay. You can be Rishi Sunak.
Well, the thing is, what we're really here to talk about today, Alistair, is not what you want to talk about. It's what I want to talk about. And what I want to talk about is what I've been talking to people about all around Inverness.
Prime Minister.
terrible
Is
embarrassment.
this a voluntary union? And if so, how does Scotland go about leaving it?
I was with Sea Scouts last night and they didn't want to talk about any of that. We were just tying knots and it was all very hard.
That's fine, but the people of Scotland, like there's an SNP government, there's a look for a referendum. How can Scotland leave the union?
But none of them have wanted to talk to me about that. And Scotland's not going to leave the union. No one in Scotland wants to leave the union. No one's
Imagine
even
me
talking about that. except
freezing
you.
in Invergordon in January, looking like I'm no in the mood. Right. But if Scotland wants to leave the union,
But Scotland doesn't want to leave the union. No one's interested in this. It was all settled in 2014, wasn't it?
but so genuinely, you did seem to be getting like you didn't lose your cool at all.
No.
But just kept repeating
did.
and made him look ridiculous by the repetition. At what point did you decide that you were going to stick with it and just be like, well, I won't let him off this time?
I don't think I made a conscious decision to do that. I was genuinely surprised that he just, they weren't, I didn't think they were particularly hard or awkward questions. He just wasn't answering any of them, so I just wasn't letting him off with that.
And that's something I do want to address, because I now see, now that I work kind of relatively in this industry, how much abuse and how personal the abuse is. Surely, and I'm not looking to age either of you, but this is a relatively recent phenomenon in your careers. Surely that's impacted how you do your job and the pleasure you can take from your job, because it's very hard to leave that at the door at the end of a shift. How does the criticism affect your work?
It's very difficult. I think that the criticism I get is often not about journalism. It's about the fact that I'm a woman. I have been told several times, is there nobody Scottish that can present this programme? Why don't you go home? Which smarts. And you just think, hang on, I choose to live and work in Scotland and I have done since I was 18. That makes me okay to be here. But I would say I'm getting better at muting people on Twitter. I'm getting better at coming off air, giving myself half an hour to look at it, deciding what's reasonable and what might not be reasonable. I'm lucky in the fact that I don't get death threats and I don't get threats of violence. A lot of my female colleagues have. So in terms of that sort of abuse, I don't get anywhere near as much as other journalists that I've spoken to.
Do you respond to any of it?
No.
No, neither do I.
That's like poking a bear. Why would you do that? I would, if any of it became violent, I would report it. We have a unit that you can report stuff like that to. But I'm very lucky so far, touch wood, that I haven't had any of that. There's some of it I mute. You just think they're not listening. They don't care. I could shout, vote for their particular side from the rooftops at 8 o'clock at the top of the news, and they'd still be raging with something I'd done. So I mute them.
That is
It does take a bit of joy out of it, though. I would say it does. If you go on Twitter, you're like, right, what now?
And I must say, I was up at Glasgow University Students' Union this morning, speaking to some student journalists who are working for student newspapers all around the UK, and I do think there was more male students in the audience than female students. And I have to think, if I was a young woman looking at the treatment that female journalists in particular seem to get, I wouldn't be inclined to go towards that industry. Do you think that will have an effect on the next generation of journalists?
I don't know, because when you're out speaking to the public are nice. 9 times out of 10, the public are good.
Yous are lovely.
Yes. So you go out, you cover a story. If we talk about the fact that sometimes the BBC isn't regarded well by people who support independence, but if I go to a massive Yes rally, then there's always people who are going to talk to me. There'll be the odd person who says, oh, you're not welcome here. They're very few and far between, So actually, the public are lovely, and you've got to bear that in mind, that Twitter isn't the public. Most Scots aren't on Twitter, and therefore, when you actually go out to a room full of people, everybody's very reasonable, and you can have a nice chat about something. And if you don't agree with it, you can disagree agreeably.
So what I want to discuss there, first of all, is local news, but also entertainment in news. So let's start with that. In order to get viewers, and in order for people to actually tune in regularly, it needs to be a bit entertaining. Like Lord Reith from the BBC said, it's there to educate, inform, and entertain. How do you make it entertaining enough without then tipping into making entertainment stuff? And how do you keep it like news that's compelling? How do you do that balance?
I mean, I wouldn't have been on a skateboard.
No.
But, you do have to make it accessible, and you have to make it... I think one of the problems with a lot of news is, on telly news, which is what I'm talking about essentially just now, is sometimes they take the fun out of the story. There can be fun in stories. And I mean, there's one, I'm thinking, I would never have done that, but I have done some slightly
not?
odd things because I would have fallen off. I've got no sense of balance whatsoever for that. But when Kezia Dugdale went into the jungle, I did do a piece to camera on the news that night from Butterfly World in Midlothian, which is sadly closed down now, with a boa constrictor around my neck and a tarantula in the palm of my hand.
I wouldn't have done that.
No, a lot of people wouldn't have done that. So that was, it was a bit of a fun story, so I had a bit of fun with that. And actually, now that I'm thinking, the first piece to camera that I did after I joined STV was about whether haggis could be imported to the States. Oh, yeah. And I did, my first piece to camera ever was addressing the haggis, basically. So it was in the McSween's factory in Midlothian, and it was this huge haggis, I mean, just enormous. And so my opening, my piece to camera was, fair for your honest sonsy face, great chieftain of the pun race, aboon them all ye attack your place, except in America. and it was quite unusual, and I say it was my very first piece to camera at STV, and it took everybody by surprise, thinking, oh, that's quite interesting.
That's a great angle. So the fun bleeds
so you
into it, absolutely.
you can have fun with it, even if it's quite a dry story. And I think trying to put the fun into it. It's not always about falling off a skateboard or whatever. I mean, the famous political one was Willie Rennie when he was at the it was the city farm in Edinburgh, and there was the two pigs behind him. That was one of the best ones ever. That was superb. And when there's something like that, you can't compete. You've just got to put it on and let people make what they will of it if you can get away with putting it on. But I try and script around things and try and make my scripts more interesting, because I'm usually just doing a live and it's just me standing there in your living room, and it could potentially be quite dry. So if you can make it sound a bit more interesting, at least that's a start. It's a bit more engaging.
Yeah, and so do you think there's an obligation on you as a broadcaster to make it, like, that this story is important, or you feel the story is important, and so you have to sweeten it a wee bit and think, well, how can I make this?
I don't know if you're sweetening it.
Well, because how do you make sort of like local government procedure, which is important? How do you make that something people will actually stay awake through? There's a limit to my powers there,
Well, you start in nurseries, or you start in somebody's house as somebody comes in, a care worker comes in to look after them. You'd have to make it, I think it's not necessarily about making it really funny.
Engaging.
But it's about making it engaging. And if you can show how that affects one person, then it's going to affect another 40 or 50,000 people around the country. And so one person's story become the story, how it affects their lives. So it could be a miserable story, but at least you've seen, well, that's how they're affected by it. And it makes it more engaging. And I suppose relatability is the point. You can see it happening in somebody else's house, and you know that it's affecting your granny the same way, then you're going to engage more with it.
So I'm really interested. You won't be able to answer this, Colin will. Pre-1973, well, what changed for Scotland that we began deserving? What changed that we began to be deserving of our own news in 1973? And what impact do you think that's had on the Scottish psyche? That, like, instead of getting all our news, because it was the Radio 4's Today programme, which is still excellent, like, it's a really high calibre of morning broadcast. But then Scotland got its own, and it's developed into Good Morning Scotland. Why did we need that? And
Ask John.
Tell us, introduce John today.
John McCormick used to be the controller of BBC Scotland, and John, to be honest, in terms of our audience, John's more likely to know than anyone else, aren't you?
The man sitting next to James Boyle was the head of Radio Scotland and the controller of Radio 4.
Well, hold on, give your mic. Well, so the question is, guys, why did Scotland need its own news, and what impact do you think that's had on the Scotland that we've all grown up in?
I think at the time, I think at the time it was the business of what the BBC was doing across the UK as ever. And Scotland, the form of it that happened in Scotland was a national network called Radio Scotland. Elsewhere in Britain, it was local radio. We didn't have local radio. We did have opt-out stations around the place, but the form that that kind of devolution took in Scotland was Radio Scotland. Of course, we deserved it.
No, but like, why didn't we have it before that?
Well, I guess you're talking about how far will the licence fee stretch? And that we got more than, I think we got more than return on investment from whatever we paid in by going for a national radio station. And I think that was completely appropriate, that we should have a national station rather than a series of local stations around the country.
Was that part of the discussion at the time, that there could have been local stations?
Yes, it was at that time, yeah.
Think of the money me and Brian could have made if there was Radio Dundee.
Yeah,
But, so, like, my final part of that question is, what impact has that had on Scotland as having a sense of nationhood? The fact that we have shared news that's Scottish news. Do you think that's had an impact on us?
I think it has had an impact. I think, I'm not sure about nationhood because we've always had that sense of nationhood. This is a country that puts a lot of emotional investment into being Scottish. But I think what it did was it gave us a sense that not just the news, but the whole business of giving a service, it gave us a sense of what we could do in music, what we could do in comedy and so forth. The whole package was there just to bump us along into the latter part of the 20th century. But I think it was the whole package rather than just news.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, it became a complex. I mean, I remember we were having a discussion over lunch about newspaper sales, Brian and others talking about the reduction in newspaper sales. And I used to be able to say to the Board of Governors coming to Scotland to try to impress them how Scotland was a different place. It wasn't just part of England, and some of them did feel that individually in those days, I'm going back to the 90s when I was controller, that individually, each of the Scottish main titles, the Herald, the Scotsman, etc., each of them outsold the combined sales of all the English newspapers in Scotland, and Scotland was different. And therefore, if this was the purchase people were making in Scotland, a newspaper that put Scottish news into the perspective and the rest of the world seen from a Scottish perspective, that's what we should be doing in BBC Scotland. And that's what led to the discussion about having an integrated television news at 6 o'clock when the Parliament came, because it wouldn't be a separate news from the rest of the news. And our feeling at that time was when education and health, which are so important to families, would devolve to Scotland, it could be very confusing, not the most accurate way to present the important news of the day. That's another story.
That's fascinating. A round of applause for our guests there. Thank you very much, lads. I'd like to move on to a very modern form of news. So we've looked at the kind of the local news there, some fascinating chat. I'm really interested in the emergence of GB News. So who's seen any GB News? We've got 3 hands, and so not loads. So who's aware of GB News as a concept? Right, so we're all on board. So it's I think I'm fair in saying it's a right-wing leaning.
To be fair, I'm not sure we're all on board.
But so it's a right-wing leaning news channel of sorts, which launched in 2021 and looked like it was going to be hilariously bad. Poor old Andrew Neil looked like he didn't know what he'd signed up for, and he was hosting this kind of monologue with dodgy mics and bad camera equipment, and it looked like it was going to fail. But it's now wall-to-wall coverage of kind of right-wing shock jockery, people just coming and giving polemics rather than giving kind of journalistically informed news. And I'm really interested because it's worked. I thought it was going to be a failure. I thought it was going to dive, but it's been very successful on social media, because if you say something radical on social media, people listen and it gets loads of shares, it gets loads of engagement, that gets the sponsors in. And it's a modern form of news style media that's much more common in America and is nothing like what you guys produce, but it's proving popular.
Has it worked?
Well, it's worked in that.
Is it making any money?
It seems like it's losing a fortune.
And nobody in this room's watching it.
No, but that's it. It's still alive. Like the bookies were giving long odds on
Ofcom are
surviving.
investigating it.
Apparently, I've been on it and been trounced by them several times. I've never actually appeared on it, but
they've watched your clips.
They've watched clips. I mean, apparently they were appalled at my interview of Rishi Sunak.
Quite right.
It was just utterly disgraceful.
Let the man talk.
Why would any journalist choose to question a politician in such a way?
But that's it.
Or at all.
I would say it's working in that what it's doing very effectively is introducing right-wing talking points to mainstream discourse, and it's employing a large number of MPs from the government on £100,000 a year salaries.
Who are still MPs.
Does that not feel like a dangerous coming together of... Because we trust broadcast news, and GB News is a broadcast news source, and I know people that watch it regularly, and it's massively affected their worldview. Does that not strike you as dangerous? What's your take on GB News? Don't talk yourself out of a future gig. Friday night with Colin Mackay.
I think you have to draw the line somewhere. No, I to be honest, I don't watch it. I see bits of what they do talked about on Twitter, and it just at times it seems like the worst of Twitter on the telly.
Yeah.
And it's not what I would consider to be proper broadcast news. I mean,
what would be the difference? What criteria?
Well, the thing is, I learned to do broadcast news from people like Brian and people like Kenny McIntyre and these people who were, you know, these are people who have been huge over many people's lives because, you know, Brian was in people's living rooms, not in a creepy way, but Brian was in people's living rooms every night for donkey's years. Kenny McIntyre was on your radio in your car when you were driving to work in the morning. I mean, Brian used to present GMS. You know, we're talking about people who you grow up listening to and watching, and who you therefore trust. Mm-hmm. Now, I would really hope that there are very, very few people growing up, particularly growing up, you know, younger people watching GB News. I don't imagine there are that many of them.
I worry.
It strikes me as being the kind of the old person's TV, the old right-wing person's TV station. But I mean, I don't think there are that many young people watching that, and I would really hope not, because that's not something you can grow up getting a balanced perspective on the news and on the world and on your community from. And therefore, I think it's just, to me, it's an appalling concept in news. It's not proper news.
Mm.
I don't watch it either. So we're all commenting stuff we don't watch. And I said earlier,
I do watch it sometimes.
I don't like it when people criticise our programme on Twitter who haven't listened. So the question it raises for me is what are the current broadcasters doing wrong that people feel that they have to go to GB News to hear their view of the world back at themselves? I listen to news and watch news and read newspapers that I hope will challenge my view of the world. So I don't just read one-sided, you know, I don't just read the Daily Mail, I read the other side of the view to make sure that I am fairly balanced and to make sure that I am always hearing the other side of the argument that, you know, from the one I might have in the back of my head. So I wonder why those people feel that that's where they have to go. And I think that's a criticism of all broadcast news into the Brexit referendum, is that I think the outcome of the Brexit referendum took everyone by surprise. And actually, there was maybe a section of the audience who weren't listening to broadcast media, and we weren't talking to them or listening to them either. So that's the question it raises for me, is should we be doing something different to engage that audience and perhaps try and measure it?
Thank you for that input. Let's hear it one more time for Laura Maxwell and for Colin Mackay. Thank you very much indeed. And please continue to explore the Kelvin Hall Moving Image Archive. It is here for you. Thank you.